All right, a note about Thanksgiving. You paid money, I'm delivering the course. If you choose to go elsewhere, then you can access it on the net, but I'm working. So enough said about that. I'll bring your papers back by then too. So you have time to study them over the weekend like you're gonna do that, but you don't have too much party or tofu or...
I was wondering, what's that kind of deal with the research paper?
What's the deal?
Yeah, like I kind of don't understand it. I was reading the description online. Just like says it's so it's like completely optional. It's just extra credit.
It is optional. It is extra credit. You have the opportunity essentially to go into more depth if you want on a topic that you're choosing that's covered by the time period 12,000 to 1877. A lot of ground there. So, and I did have some suggestions, but naturally, people decide to do what they're going to do. So, come back yet? No, okay. All right. Any other questions? No? Really? Okay. Always the challenge with doing stuff electronically. Oh, I get it. My bad. That's the way it shows up. Okay, got it. All right, the new Jim Crow, which is a concept we may not have covered yet, but I'm assuming you may have heard of it. Anybody not heard of it? Okay. So, the whole question of citizenship in the United States revolves around who's a citizen. Like, for example, the question about within the Constitution, we the people, who is that? Well, that isn't every human being. So in the indigenous democracies and in the African democracies, indeed, in the democracies that existed before Europe, before the Dark Ages, democracy is everybody. Unless you were in a feudal system, in which case the king and the royalty were the only citizens and you were their slaves. Serfs were slaves, essentially. So Jim Crow was basically a set of laws because the meme of the United States Constitution did not extend citizenship to everybody. Legalized forms of discrimination would be put in place. So part of the lesson that we draw from African American history is that every time you fight for an advance, there's usually some kind of backlash. Almost always. So I could have defined the new Jim Crow first, and I will, but I'm bringing it to how this is relevant today. So the new Jim Crow, before you get to the old Jim Crow, there's a woman named Michelle Alexander who was at the university last week. Some of you already have seen her, and this is the title of her book. She's a lawyer by trade, black woman, And she basically focused on civil rights law. And so basically what she's talking about, what holds the new Jim Crow together is the belief that some of us are not worthy of compassion. As an example, essentially our policy around substances and illegal drugs. So what you could gather from axiochemistry last week is that our drug laws are basically driven from a particular axiology which could view all problems as a medical problem and basically apply the correct medical procedure to everyone, regardless of race, class, or anything. But we don't. And then, so because dichotomous logic is a hallmark of that axiology, you have good drug users and bad drug users. And the good drug users basically get a pass, and the bad drug users get jail or arrest, right? If Robert Downey, you switch Robert Downey with, pick your favorite black actor with a drug problem. Robert Downey and O.J. Simpson, say. The treatment is different, even though the drugs may be the same. So really, should we bifurcate by race and class? No, it's a medical problem, right? So some people are not worthy of compassion. So there's a new racial underclass that exists that's invisible to those of us who have jobs, houses, etc., and in the virtual prison they live in, and they don't actually have to even be in prison anymore. Prison is replicated out in society. So part of that's what she's talking about. So the mass incarceration of poor people of color is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, they don't even have to be necessarily people of color, because it's certain that white convicts are not necessarily treated with any equality either. And so part of the thing, I was at the Oregon Students of Color Coalition conference, and so I said, on a panel for ethnic studies professors, I said, look, most of the students taking my class are white kids. And so the point being, and I've been accused of being a racist for saying this, but it's like, what was once done to us for race is now being done to you for the money. Because there's money in having private prisons and keeping people. Just like our medical system is really based on paying sick people support the system rather than making sure people don't get the disease in the first place. So yeah, it's better to expand the criminal class than to prevent crime in a way that would be effective and more just. So rather than use racial labels, we just labeled them criminal. Then all the Jim Crow memes become just as viable, but now devoid of race. Which is a neat trick, even if you're doing the same thing. Well, it's not racial, just because we don't mention any overt racial terms. It's not racial. They're just criminal. Which when we start getting to, we already talked about the Oregon amendments to the Constitution and their Constitution. And so when the Oregon Constitution becomes imported into the U.S. Constitution, pretty much unchanged, we're outlawing slavery except for commission of a crime. Well, who defines what a crime is, and what is a crime? Was a crime in Mississippi the same as a crime in Massachusetts? No. And then who is the crime applied to? So, more black men are incarcerated today for drug offenses than were in slavery in 1850. Let me repeat that. More black men are incarcerated today for drug offenses than were in slavery in 1850. The United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any nation on earth, and most of those are for drug offenses, interestingly enough. And as a result of also this, and what she said is there are more black men who are disenfranchised. That means they can't vote as a result of a felony conviction. Now, this will vary from state to state. This is one of the states where actually felons can vote. But there are some states where you lose your ability to vote permanently on the basis of a pot ticket, a pot conviction loses you the right to vote. Okay, so more black men are disenfranchised today than were in 1870, and the reason that date is relevant is that we're firmly into Reconstruction at that point. So, if you count prisoners as people, for example, then they're excluded from because prisoners are actually excluded from the poverty statistics. Maybe you didn't know that, but they are. So 80% of black men in Chicago are relegated to permanent second-class status. So it is a racial caste system rather than a justice system. So in 30 years, the prison system quintupled, 5 times growth. So largest number of incarcerated people in the history of the world as long as we've been tracking that currently in the United States. So black incarceration rates have soared regardless of the crime rate. And so because of the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, which originated as part of the Republican Southern strategy, which essentially, one of the things when we talk about sociostructural violence, one of the key tests is your percentage in the population. So we say that black people as a whole are 13% of the population. Then, all things being equal, we should find a 13% distribution of crime, a 13% distribution of disease, et cetera, et cetera. We don't. And basically the test of disproportionality is 2 times the normal distribution. So we would look for, if there's like 26% or more of black people in prison, then it's not random chance. There is something creating that. It's not, so basically just like a coin toss, 50% heads, 50% tails, whether you do 10 or 10,000. The probability remains the same. Now, if you started seeing multiple, like 3 times as many heads as tails, then there's something producing it. There's something funny with a coin or some other force. Within disproportionality, one of the things we're looking for is something happening at greater rate than you'd expect from random chance. So 80% is one of those things. And when we look at the entire justice system in terms of how black people are represented, well, are they committing more of the crime even when the crime rate goes up? No, they're not. But they're getting arrested, so that's different. So drug convictions have increased 1,000%. But part of that is you can have your property taken away, your vote taken away without a conviction. They can just arrest you. And what the feds actually pay local municipalities for is for numbers of arrests. Whether those arrests result in a conviction or not doesn't matter. You can lose your property, your car, your bank account, et cetera, simply by being arrested for a drug offense. And then you have to fight to get it back if you're not convicted. So, more people incarcerated today for drug offenses than in 1980 for all offenses. So again, drug offenses. For one thing, drug manufacturing is one thing, drug addiction and possession is another, where you can basically relate to and reduce those problems in other ways other than arresting your way out of the problem. So part of the Republican Southern strategy to get tough, starting certainly back in the 60s, Democrats, like Clinton, also promoted and expanded the strategy to get white swing votes, because they had to appear to be tough on crime, and crime, like urban, became a code word for race. Certainly the stockbrokers that caused the bubble crash are criminals. Certainly you can steal more money with a computer than with a gun, but with a computer you get less time even though you steal more money because of the violence of a gun or the threat of a gun. I mean, you can check this out with bank robbers too. Bank robbers who use a note or an implied gun get different time than bank robbers that actually show a gun. And they both never get away with more than a couple of $1,000s, if that. So, state and local law enforcement get cash for numbers, not convictions. So they can seize property and cash for suspicion, not actual conviction, which is the way the law is written. So racial bias cases, so as an example, when we looked at this from a policy point of view, and the reason I'm talking about this today is today's conditions had its roots back in the time period we're actually studying. So racial bias cannot be brought to the Supreme Court unless you can offer evidence tantamount to an admission. You can't even bring the case to trial. So the biases that operationalize the practices are unconscious and play out enormous disparities. So basically, unless you get a cop to say, I saw this black guy, so I suspected that he was using or that he possessed. So even though, for example, in traffic stops, when they, blacks and Latinos get stopped more, but it's whites that are usually carrying the drugs in those stops. So both blacks and Latinos get stopped 3 to 4 times more. And I'm talking about the Oregon stats. And basically they found drugs 13% of the time. Whereas when they stopped whites who were carrying, on that same suspicion using the same circumstances, more than half of them had drugs on them. So they tend to focus on minorities rather than the people who are actually using, which their own statistics are showing, you could be doing something different to be more effective. So effectively what this legitimizes is a permanent second-class status for people who might get caught with something, but actually they've even convicted people who simply passed on a message to a drug dealer and said, oh, well, you're part of the conspiracy, you go to jail too. So more than $1 trillion has been spent on the drug war, which makes it, behind the current shooting wars that we have. So to counter this, there would have to be a movement which ends all forms of discrimination, which enables the prisoners and other people caught up in this system to access food, shelter, and jobs. See, once you get a federal conviction, you can't, whether you can vote in the state or not, you can't get food stamps, you can't get shelter, you can't get public housing. There is that part in the job application where they ask if you've ever been convicted, and even if you lie, they can actually find out otherwise. So we have essentially recreated slavery and a caste system. So some of the solutions that Ms. Alexander proposed was an underground railroad for people who've been incarcerated, basically creating safe places. As a lawyer, basically you could look at changing the law, but if you appeal, for example, SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States, basically said it was not an Eighth Amendment violation to sentence a first-time black drug offender to life imprisonment in a particular state. Probably Texas, because they put a brother in jail for 40 years for possession of 2 joints in the 70s. 40 years for 2 joints. They don't play in Texas. Don't mess with Texas. So, restorative justice, the concept of restorative justice, rather than retributive justice, so retribution, basically, and restorative. The idea with restorative justice is that crime occurs because there's been a breakdown in the relationships between people and society. So, restorative justice takes into account victims, the offender, and society as a whole. We talked about this yet? So part of the piece, when you look at, especially in an axiological context, science itself is also a matter of the worldview of a particular people. So we've been conditioned to think of science as basically that part which is objective, but really scientific research consists of asking and answering questions. And it goes along with that concept of enantiodromia. Have I used that term with you? Okay. This is my standard of reference for finding the right dictionary. Do they have this word in it? Enantiodromia. And it's a Greek word, and it literally means that which arises from its opposite. And it's a handy term. Enantiodromia. You know, a black nerd would come up with a word like that. Anti-disestablishmentarianism, enantiodromia. All right, so that which arises from its opposite. So, for example, cure for disease is in the disease. So then you define what is a disease. Now there are some, and I'm basically presaging a couple of slides ahead, but there are some that basically say that racism is a mental illness. Basically using the precepts in Western psychology which defines schizophrenia, for example. So schizophrenia involves delusions, paranoia, denial, projection, all these different things, blaming, justification, etc. Schizophrenia, basically a break from reality, usually often caused by trauma or perceived trauma. So, to this day, the American Psychological Association does not consider racism as having any emotional or psychological impact on people of color or whites. Doesn't acknowledge it at all. Okay, so for example, this is a different time period, but people getting lynched, the perpetrators were ordinary citizens, sometimes even law enforcement. They wouldn't be considered mentally ill then or now. Timothy McVeigh was a good soldier when he bombed Oklahoma City Federal Building. He's not considered mentally ill. No, I did it. Good soldier. even though he was part of a, virulent anti-government white supremacist movement, which was also actively racist. Oh, well, he's actively racist. Well, those are his political views, have nothing to do with his mental state. So blowing up a federal building is normal behavior? Oh, well, no, it's not normal behavior, but okay. So where did this idea come from within the scientific community? A guy named Samuel Cartwright, who we'll meet at some point thematically. But enantiodromia, the cure for the disease is in the disease. So if you think that racism is a mental illness, then the cure for racism is exploring the memes that hold it together, if you're going to find a solution. But the resistance to that within the medical community is basically, oh, we don't want to pathologize racism. Well, why? Is it normal or not? Well, it's not normal. We don't want to make it into a disease. Well, if you did, then you could basically define what treatment is. I'm not sure that Prozac would have cured Tim McVeigh, or a Klansman, or a Nazi, but we could look at treatment for that, or we could look at treatment for the people who are targets. So, usually in enantiodromia, besides the cure for the disease, the opposite is in the disease. So there's 3 principles. 1, problems create solutions. Then, once you have the solution to the problem, solutions create more problems. And then, as Albert once said, I'm paraphrasing him, Einstein, the way you see the problem is the problem. So the solution then is, how do you change the way you think about the problem? How are you conceptualizing it? So, when black people, black psychiatrists, black psychologists, black people with degrees in psychology look at the silence, basically being targeted for various forms of isms within the matrix of domination, when we study solutions and we study the problem, we come up with statements like Sillin and Thomas talk about, and I'm quoting them here, in its long and ugly history in the United States, white racism has improvised 1,000 variations on 2 basic themes. 1, black people are born with inferior brains and unlimited capacity for growth. Okay, so we invent algebra, numbering system, pharmacology, science, astronomy, etc., but we have inferior brains. Now, will taking a black history course mandatorily making everybody